If you've ever been over to the Rocky Mountain Arsenal Wildlife Refuge, you know the roaming buffalo are really something to see. In its past life, it produced deadly weapons of war.
Now the state of Colorado is suing the U.S. government over who should control the contaminated areas that remain at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal.
In 1989, biologists released 714 rodents onto a piece of ground so toxic the Army had buried it under crushed concrete. The soil underneath had soaked up mustard gas, nerve agent, and 30 years of industrial pesticide runoff. Nobody expected the rodents to survive the year. 26 years later, that same dead ground became the only place on Earth where the rarest mammal in North America, an animal officially declared extinct in the wild, was breeding under open sky. The secret factory outside Denver. 10 miles northeast of downtown Denver, behind chain link and razor wire, the U.S. Army built one of the largest chemical weapons plants in the country.
We need to know where that word arsenal came from so that we can make sure it doesn't happen again.
The Rocky Mountain Arsenal opened in 1942, days after Pearl Harbor, on 20,000 acres of high plains seized for the war effort. For 4 decades, that ground produced some of the most lethal substances ever synthesized on American soil. During the war, the facility churned out mustard gas, nerve agent precursors, napalm, and white phosphorus. When the war ended, the factory did not close. It pivoted. The Army leased huge sections to Shell Oil, which used the same infrastructure to manufacture commercial pesticides: Aldrin, Dieldrin, Endrin, Chlordane. For 30 years, 2 industries ran toxic operations on the same patch of ground, and neither one cared where the waste went. Where it went was straight into the earth. Crews dumped millions of gallons of raw chemical runoff into unlined trenches and open ponds. Basin F alone, a 93-acre pit lined with nothing but a thin layer of asphalt, held over 200 million gallons of liquid waste. The Colorado sun evaporated the liquid until the chemicals concentrated into a sludge so toxic it killed birds on contact. In the early 1960s, the Army tried to bury the problem. Engineers drilled a hole 12,000 feet down into the bedrock and pumped 165 million gallons of toxic liquid into it under extreme pressure. The pressurized fluid cracked open ancient fault lines. Denver started having earthquakes, magnitude 5, in a city that had never experienced seismic activity in recorded history. By the time the EPA designated the site one of the worst toxic dumps in America in 1987, investigators had identified over 600 distinct chemical compounds in the soil and water. The land could not support life. The plumes of contamination were creeping toward municipal wells supplying drinking water to 1.5 million people. But 40 years of armed military fencing had done something nobody planned. Inside the buffer zones, the land had stayed completely untouched. No plowing, no development, no suburban sprawl. While every acre of farmland around Denver was being paved over, the arsenal perimeter accidentally preserved scattered patches of native shortgrass prairie, and inside them, colonies of black-tailed prairie dogs that had been quietly surviving for decades. The military's obsession with secrecy had built a nature preserve inside a chemical weapons plant. Nobody noticed until the 1980s, when biologists found something else hiding behind the fence. The eagles that rewrote the plan. In 1986, federal biologists working on the arsenal discovered a massive communal roost of bald eagles wintering in the buffer zones. The eagles, protected under federal law, had been drawn by the absence of human disturbance, the mature cottonwood trees, and the abundant prey provided by those surviving prairie dog colonies. The discovery launched a political fight. The Audubon Society, the Sierra Club, and local activists pushed the same argument. This land should become a refuge, not a subdivision. Congress eventually agreed. Now, the Fish and Wildlife Service had a problem. They had 15,000 acres of biologically dead dirt, scraped, compacted, and stripped by the cleanup machinery. The native seed bank was gone, the fungal networks were gone, the soil structure was gone. What remained could not absorb water, could not support roots, and could not sustain anything. They did not have the budget to rebuild a prairie with seed trucks and tilling equipment at that scale. They needed a living engine that could restructure soil, cycle nutrients, alter vegetation, and create habitat all at once. They needed the prairie dogs. But there was an engineering problem first. Beneath the surface, crews had sealed the worst contamination under engineered caps. where the poison ran deeper than 10 feet, and in many places it did. They left it in place under barriers designed to shed every drop of rain. Prairie dogs dig. They dig deep. They dig constantly. If a colony established itself on top of a capped zone, they could tunnel straight through the barrier and drag toxic material back to the surface. So, engineers built something into the caps, 18 inches of crushed concrete, sized and compacted so precisely that no burrowing mammal on the continent could get through it. The toxic past was physically separated from the biological future by a wall of rubble.
Hundreds of prairie dogs will soon be digging new homes at the Rocky Mountain National Wildlife Refuge, Rocky Flats, that is.
In 1989, biologists released 714 prairie dogs across the prepared sections of the refuge. 134 came from unaffected areas within the arsenal. 534 were rescued from urban construction sites across Denver by a volunteer organization, often pulled out of bulldozer paths hours before the equipment arrived. 46 more came from a radio tracking study. They were ear-tagged, dusted for fleas, and released into prepared burrows. The job description was simple: stabilize the soil, keep the dust down. Nobody on the relocation crew was thinking about apex predators. They were thinking about a refuge full of rodents on a former weapons site, hoping the project lasted long enough to publish the results. The extinct predator returns. 26 years later, on October 5th, 2015, wildlife managers opened a series of crates in the northeast section of the refuge and released approximately 30 black-footed ferrets into the prairie dog colonies. Black-footed ferrets are the rarest mammal in North America. In 1979, they were declared extinct in the wild. 2 years later, a ranch dog in Meeteetse, Wyoming, dragged one home. A tiny surviving population of 18 animals was captured and placed into a captive breeding program. Every single black-footed ferret alive today descends from that group. They eat almost nothing but prairie dogs. A single ferret needs between 100 and 150 prairie dogs per year to survive. They live almost exclusively inside prairie dog burrows. They cannot exist without dense, healthy, plague-managed colonies. Period. The fact that ferrets could be released at the arsenal at all was the proof. Not proof that somebody had a good idea or wrote a good grant proposal. Physical proof, measured in burrow density and prey abundance, that the food web had been rebuilt from chemically sterilized ground to a fully functional system capable of sustaining an apex predator. The entire pyramid was there. Soil microbes at the bottom, then grasses, then prairie dogs, then raptors and owls, and at the very top, an animal that had been erased from the wild 40 years earlier, breeding in the open on land that had manufactured nerve gas within living memory. By 2018, the population had expanded to roughly 90 individuals. To understand what that number means, place it in context. There are more black-footed ferrets at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal than there are wild giant pandas in some Chinese reserves. They hunt at night, dropping into prairie dog burrows head first and killing the inhabitants underground in tunnels engineered, in some cases, on top of buried mustard gas. Refuge biologists track them with spotlights and eyeshine, walking the prairie at 3 in the morning to confirm that the rarest carnivore on the continent is still out there, still breeding, still feeding on a food chain that did not exist 30 years ago. Quick pause. If the idea of an extinct predator quietly breeding on top of buried nerve gas just made the hair on your arms stand up, hit subscribe before we get to how 714 rodents pulled it off. Then stay with me, because the chain reaction that built this is stranger than the reveal. What the rodents did to dead ground. Start at the bottom. The first thing the prairie dogs did was attack the soil itself. Each burrow system punched channels deep into the compacted earth, creating pathways for rainwater that had previously sheeted off the surface like it was hitting pavement. The water started soaking in. As the rodents excavated, they hauled mineral-rich material from depth up to the surface and mixed it with organic matter from their waste and from decaying plant material around their mounds. Microbial communities that had been crushed out of existence by remediation machinery began recolonizing the loosened earth. The soil started cycling nutrients again. The prairie dogs were not digging holes. They were rebuilding the dirt from the inside out. Once the soil started functioning, the chain accelerated. Prairie dogs are relentless grazers. They clip every plant within sight of their burrows down to almost nothing. not because they are hungry, but because they need clear sight lines to spot predators. This selective trimming suppresses tall grasses and woody shrubs and favors a very specific kind of plant: short, fast-growing, protein-rich, broadleaf species that thrive under constant grazing pressure. Within a few years, the vegetation around the expanding colonies shifted dramatically. Instead of the weedy ground cover that colonizes disturbed land, the prairie dog zones developed a patchwork of closely cropped, nutrient-dense plants interspersed with bare ground and taller grass on the edges. This was a different kind of habitat, one that had not existed on the Front Range in decades. Species that had been absent for just as long started showing up to use it. What made this work, and what almost no restoration project ever gets right, was the speed. Most reclaimed industrial land sits stalled in a kind of ecological limbo for decades, a few stubborn weeds refusing to make way for anything more complex. The arsenal moved through the same successional stages in years instead of generations. Biologists tracking soil samples across the prairie dog zones documented carbon levels rising, fungal networks re-establishing, and seed banks rebuilding from windblown deposits caught in the disturbed earth around the burrows. The colonies were not just changing the surface. They were running a compressed restart of an entire ecosystem from below. The birds that moved in underground. Burrowing owls came first. These small raptors cannot dig their own homes. They depend entirely on burrows excavated by other animals. As the colonies spread, thousands of abandoned tunnel entrances became available. Temperature-regulated nesting cavities, protected from weather and most predators. The owls took up residence in the older sections of the colonies, raising their young underground in tunnels engineered by rodents.
It was a place that they made sarin gas, they made napalm, they made fuel.
Then the open ground specialists arrived. Mountain plovers, ground nesting birds that need bare, flat, heavily grazed earth to breed, found exactly the stripped-down terrain that prairie dog colonies create. Studies on the arsenal showed that plovers nesting on active colonies produce larger chicks with higher survival rates than those nesting elsewhere. Meanwhile, ferruginous hawks and red-tailed hawks established territories overhead, drawn by concentrated, visible, accessible prey. The bald eagles, the same species whose accidental discovery in the 1980s had triggered the entire refuge designation, returned in growing numbers, roosting in the mature cottonwoods and hunting the prairie dog towns through winter. The animal that accidentally saved the arsenal was now thriving because of what the arsenal had become. The bison return. The next link was the largest animal to arrive. In 2007, wildlife managers introduced a herd of wild bison to the refuge. This was not a sentimental gesture. It was a calculated move built on the foundation the prairie dogs had created. Bison are heavy grazers that naturally seek out the kind of short, nutritious forage that prairie dog colonies produce. On the historical Great Plains, the two species operated in a loop. Prairie dogs clipped the grass short and promoted high-protein plants. Bison grazed the taller vegetation on the colony edges and kept it from encroaching. The resulting mosaic maintained ideal conditions for both. At the arsenal, the partnership rebooted almost immediately. The bison gravitated to the prairie dog zones. Their grazing reinforced the open structure the rodents needed for predator detection. Their hooves churned the soil in ways that opened new germination sites for native grass seeds. Their dung returned concentrated nutrients to the surface in a pattern no fertilizer truck could replicate. The loop closed. Two species that had not shared this landscape since before the Civil War were operating as a functional unit again, each making conditions better for the other. The invisible enemy underground. Through all of this, one threat kept trying to collapse the system from underneath. Sylvatic plague, carried by fleas and caused by the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death, tore through the colonies 6 times between 1989 and 2002. Each outbreak killed up to 95% of the prairie dogs in the affected zones. Each time, the chain stalled. Owls lost their burrows, plovers lost their nesting ground, raptors lost their prey base. Refugee biologists fought back with increasingly sophisticated tools. First, they dusted individual burrows by hand with insecticide that killed the fleas on contact. Effective, but painfully slow at 6 acres a day across a refuge the size of a small city. Then they developed something remarkable, a peanut butter-flavored vaccine bait engineered to trigger an immune response in any prairie dog that ate it, protecting the animal from plague without ever having to catch or handle it. The baits were dyed green, laced with a fluorescent marker that showed up in the animal's whiskers so biologists could confirm who had eaten them.
This area was designated as a Superfund site, so it was a candidate for cleanup.
And distributed across the prairie using modified all-terrain vehicles that could cover 60 acres an hour. Drones would have been faster, but Denver International Airport sits right next door. So, ATVs it was. This was not pest control. It was immunological infrastructure built specifically to protect the biological engine running the entire restoration. Without the vaccine program, the ferret release would never have happened because the food supply would have collapsed every 3 years like clockwork. The scale of what grew back. Step back and look at the full chain. 714 prairie dogs, released into scraped, compacted, biologically dead soil, broke the ground open. The broken ground absorbed water. The water fed plants. The plants shifted toward high-protein species under grazing pressure. The new plant community attracted bison, which reinforced the grazing structure. The burrow systems housed owls. The bare ground supported plovers that raised bigger, healthier chicks. The concentrated prey base drew hawks and eagles. And the whole system, the density, the diversity, the structural complexity, reached a threshold where it could support the most endangered carnivore on the continent. One species, one intervention, a cascade that crossed every boundary, soil, water, plants, birds, mammals, predators, and rebuilt a complete ecosystem on top of a sealed toxic waste dump. Today, the refugee spans over 15,000 acres, the largest urban wildlife preserve in the United States, completely surrounded by the Denver metro area. It supports more than 330 documented species of plants and animals. It receives over 340,000 visitors a year on land that was under armed military lockdown for half a century. The EPA removed nearly 16,000 acres from its list of the most contaminated sites in America, certifying them clean enough for unrestricted public use. 917 of those acres were sold to Commerce City and now hold a high school, a civic center, a professional soccer stadium, and 400 acres of public parks. The total cleanup cost was $2.1 billion. In some years, this single site consumed up to 80% of the entire Department of Defense environmental cleanup budget. But the force that rebuilt the living surface, the biological engine that restructured the soil, reshaped the vegetation, attracted the grazers, housed the birds, and fed the predators, was a rodent that weighs about 2 pounds.
Several very important species, including some that are listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act.
The Rocky Mountain Arsenal did not come back because someone planted a forest, or seeded a meadow, or trucked in topsoil by the ton. It came back because the right animal was placed into the right conditions at the right time, and the physics of the system did the rest. The prairie dogs did not know they were rebuilding a food web. The bison did not know they were reinforcing the rodent's habitat. The owls did not know they were filling a niche that had been empty for 60 years. None of it was coordinated from above. All of it was inevitable from below. 600 distinct chemical compounds are still buried under that prairie. They have not gone anywhere. Mustard gas residue, nerve agent breakdown products, decades of pesticide sludge, all of it sealed in double-lined landfills and capped under 18 inches of crushed concrete. Above that concrete, the prairie dogs dig every single day. Some of their burrows run within feet of the barrier, the animals working their tunnel systems closer to the line every season as the colonies expand outward into the safer zones. The wall holds, the system holds. Every pump, every monitoring well, every sealed cap is doing exactly what it was engineered to do for now. Engineered barriers do not last forever. Concrete cracks under freeze-thaw cycles. Polyethylene liners degrade. Pumps fail when the funding line drops. The site is monitored under a federal agreement that runs in perpetuity, but perpetuity assumes a federal agency that still exists, a budget that still gets approved, and a crew of technicians showing up to read the gauges every quarter. Nobody knows what the arsenal looks like in 200 years, when the ferrets are gone, and the funding has dried up, and the prairie keeps digging anyway. The only thing standing between 600 chemical compounds and the surface is a layer of rubble, and the assumption that nothing ever fails. The most toxic ground in America is also the most alive. Both things are true at the same time, in the same square mile of dirt, separated by inches. Tell me in the comments which species you think deserves the title of greatest landscape engineer in North America. Subscribe if you want the next strange piece of natural history to find you before anyone else sees it.